Many people from around the world want to pack up and leave and work remotely from another country. Many of those people are interested in moving to Portugal. In this episode of Not Your Average Globetrotter, I quickly want to talk about some of the things that you could think about that are maybe some of the positives and negatives about working remotely from Portugal. Roll that intro. Hello there, I'm Rafael de Furia, back at it again on another Friday night, and let's just jump straight into this. Good internet connectivity. In Portugal, for the most part, in the cities, you will have a pretty decent connection. In some more urban areas where you have a lot higher density, your connection for wireless internet on your phone, for example, may sometimes get a little slower, but you may be in an area with 5G that actually is quite fast and quite easy to use. So it depends on what you're using to connect to the internet. If you're using a wired connection, Portugal, in my opinion, is an amazing place to be if you're not going to be in some place like the US. It is possible to get fiber lines here. Maybe if you're living out in the countryside, some of these things could be a little bit more difficult and could be a little bit more costly. The costs in general, though, are not the cheapest in the world, but they're also not as expensive as what you may find in the US, again, for example. And from the main carriers, if you are getting a wired internet connection, it will come at various tiers with various options and various speeds. So that's something else to consider with your mobile phone line, that you might find an unlimited rate for a great price, but it could be capped at a very slow speed. So if you are looking at that, that is something definitely to take into consideration if you are going to be working using a mobile hotspot connection. The next thing that I want to talk about is in regards to the cost of living. The cost of living has definitely been going up in Portugal, like I have mentioned in a number of recent episodes of Not Your Average Globetrotter. But even in comparison to some of the most popular destinations in the world, it is lower cost. However, when you're comparing Portugal to many other digital nomad destinations that are quite popular, such as maybe places in Central and South America or even Southeast Asia, the costs that you can find in Portugal can often be higher. But if you do get out into a smaller village or into the countryside, then this, of course, is a different situation yet again. I do know of people who are working from the countryside and have been able to get good internet and run a full business while living on a much lower monthly expenditure. So it is possible overall to bring down your cost of living, but it is going to depend on where you're going. If you're going to a place like Lisbon or Porto, then of course, these are going to be places where you may have some difficulty in finding the dirt cheap prices that are sometimes mentioned in some of these articles and news stories. Of course, part of the cost of living could be your taxation. Of course, the following is not tax advice, and you should definitely speak with a qualified professional, but just my personal opinions here. The taxation for your business, whether you're doing it personally or as a corporate business, however you're set up, this is, of course, important to take into consideration. You do have tax schemes like the NHR status, which are good for 10 years, or if you set up a business here, then you can get into something a bit more permanent. And in some cases, like for example, personally, that made more sense to set that up. Theoretically, I could also do NHR on top of that. With how I've been able to work with my accountant, it ended up making the most sense that I didn't need to get on to that regime. But of course, for each individual person, it's going to vary greatly. There are going to be some people where Portugal will offer really awesome options for what you might be spending in taxes. Or for other people, I mean, especially if you come from a country like the US, where it's citizenship-based taxation, then there could be an aspect which might complicate your income here in the country, especially if you decide that you want to base your company or your business out of a place like, say, Tennessee. I know a few people who've gone through that route and setting up something there. But then you find other options, especially if you're not American, then there are other advantages that if you don't have citizenship-based taxation, then you can definitely be able to take advantage of various systems that exist in Europe. Some of them may be a little bit more complicated. Some of them may be a little bit more simplified. If you're dealing with everything in the country where you're living, then of course, that can make things a bit more straightforward. But there could be other ways of organizing your taxation that could be a little bit more complicated paperwork-wise, but bring down your overall tax for the year. But of course, when taking the topic of taxation into account, you definitely need to speak to a professional who knows what they're doing and knows how to navigate these systems. Another thing to talk about when it comes to Portugal is the safety and security. Of course, like anywhere in the world, things can happen here. Portugal in general is much safer than many other places. However, there are things that can happen. So you do want to keep that in mind, especially if you are in maybe one of the larger cities, that you do still have to keep your guard up. And when you're walking around, be very aware of your surroundings. Just because it may be one of the safer countries in the world doesn't mean that all of a sudden that there's absolutely zero. I have heard of some very horrible things happening in this country, but of course, it's not something that happens on such a regular basis like it may happen in other parts of the world. So, of course, another thing that you would want to take into consideration for emergency situations would be healthcare, even non-emergency situations. Depending on your nationality and how things are for you, you may want to get private healthcare, or you may have to get private healthcare when coming out here. And the costs for that can be quite reasonable in comparison to other parts of the world. Again, namely the USA. Or if you're an EU citizen, for example, if you have Irish citizenship that you've been able to get through your ancestry, or Italian or Polish or German, whatever it may be, then you may be in a different category. And depending on if there's reciprocity between your country and Portugal, well, we'll say the country of your passport, then you may have access to free medical care and only have to be concerned about your general annual social contributions or what your employer may be contributing towards that. And of course, in many situations, having to go to a medical professional in Portugal will be significantly less than what you would ever have to consider in the US, again, just as another example. Another thing that's really nice about Portugal, especially if you are a digital nomad or you are somebody who is considering to work remotely but spend a bit more time and maybe have more of a permanent base here in Portugal as more of an expat rather than a digital nomad moving around all the time, there are a lot of co-working spaces that you can find in the cities here. Portugal is a country that has seen a lot of people come here, a lot of people who are looking to work remotely. I've been looking at things here in Portugal actually for a number of years just because I keep my eye on different countries in the world and what's happening there and how it's happening, just always to keep up with what's going on. But I can say I've seen here in Portugal just over the years that there have been more and more and more that show up because of such a vibrant digital nomad community that you see in some parts of the country. I'm not saying you see it everywhere, but places like Lisbon and Porto really do attract a number of people that do fit into that lifestyle, even people who are more in the expat phase of their life where they're happy to be in one place rather than nomading around. I do know a number of people who will go and use those services, and the cost can actually be quite reasonable. And even as far as I'm aware, there are a number of companies that actually have multiple locations around the country, so you can actually pay your regular fee that you would have, but then have access in different locations if you want to go and maybe spend a week in one place, but have access to workspace or a month, whatever it may be, a couple of days, and you need just a place where you can sit down and be comfortable. Definitely worth considering. I can say it's not something that I've done just because my work setup is a bit bulky, but I have thought about that it would be nice to be able to go to one of these co-working spaces, especially to connect with others. There are going to be places where maybe it's a little bit more social and a little bit less social. It's all going to be very, very dependent on where you are and when you're there. Another thing that I'd like to touch on is how welcoming the Portuguese can be. Here, I have found so many people that really try and make an effort to help you. Of course, not everybody is going to be there and roll out the red carpet for you. Never expect to go to any place and have the red carpet rolled out for you. But what I'm saying is that when you make an effort here, people really appreciate that. I've been in other places when you make an effort that they're like, well, this is where we are. How come you don't speak the language right? Or how come you don't know how to communicate like we do? Or you don't know how this certain social norm may be in this country? I can say I've seen this in the States as well as other places. I'm not naming just one place in particular. But here in Portugal, I have seen so often that when you really make an effort, that people will try to meet you halfway. Or that in some places, maybe if you ask somebody if they speak English, they say, no. This almost immediate, no, how dare you ask me such a question? Whereas here in Portugal, I've had a number of situations, even though I can communicate in a language, where I have had to have situations where my Portuguese wasn't quite enough for the context of the situation, that I was asking if that person maybe spoke English, and I got an apology. I wasn't being reprimanded for asking. And that's something that I've seen more here in Portugal, that, oh, I'm sorry, my English is not so good, or I don't speak it very well. I'm not going to ever be the person to say that, oh, you're going to find it so easy to speak English here and that there are so many English speakers. I'm not going to say that at all. What I'm going to say is that it may be a little bit more friendly in Portugal as an English speaker than in other places in the world that may have fewer English speakers around and potentially available at a shop, for example. Not everywhere will you be able to find people who speak English, but I can say that it's definitely more common here than in other countries that I've lived in. Another thing about working remotely from Portugal is that if you do have to travel for work, or you just want to have access to other places, you always have flights to different places, to major locations around Europe. If you want to go to, say, I live in Braga, not far from Porto. If I want to take a flight to Madrid, they're very, very reasonable. Actually, some of the flights that I've seen to fly from Porto to Madrid are cheaper than flying from Porto to Lisbon. And when I'm talking cheaper, I'm talking about, instead of paying maybe 86 euros or 82 euros, I forget the price off the top of my head, I'm talking about maybe like 30 or 40 euros round trip. These things happen. You can find even cheaper than that if you really, really keep your eyes open. And those sorts of prices also exist when you're considering to go to other locations. It's not just because we're in the Iberian Peninsula. That does help. And of course, it's not just flights that you can take, but you have buses and trains, at least to get to Spain. And one other factor that I know a lot of digital nomads look for is a diverse culture and population. And that is something that you can definitely see here in Portugal, that there are many faces to the Portugal that you can experience. There can be the more Anglo side of Portugal. There can be the more local Portuguese style. There's also the African and the South American and the Asian. There are these different communities that exist here that all function together in one way or another. There can, of course, be separation between the various communities here, but you do see a lot of people from around the world. And of course, if you stick to the smaller cities and villages, you may really only interact with local Portuguese. I'm not complaining about that. I think, like I said, the Portuguese are wonderful people. But if you are looking for a multicultural experience, you can find it. It's not going to be maybe as diverse as other places, but I know it is a factor that many digital nomads are looking for, that they're looking for not just to be in a place, but also to have a cultural experience and to experience different cultures, different places, different people that they may have not connected with otherwise. But rather than keep on going too much, I may make this into a multi-part series about some of the benefits of living in Portugal as a remote worker, or just benefits of living in Portugal in general. So thank you so much for joining in for this episode of Not Your Average Globetrotter. Of course, a huge thank you to those of you who help to make episodes like this possible on a regular basis through rafaeldefuria.com/Patreon, patreon.com/rafaeldefuria for the monthly support, as well as the one-time donations such as the thanks button or through rafaeldefuria.com/support. It all so very greatly helps this project to be able to continue. So thank you all so much for being a part of it, as well as taking part in the conversation down below in the comment section here on YouTube. It's always a pleasure and a joy to hear what you guys have to say, because there's always so many thoughtful ideas that are shared that, of course, whenever I can, I love to interact with you guys and hear more of what you have to say. And of course, as always, I'm Rafael de Furia. Stay safe and healthy out there, and I will see you all next time for another episode of Not Your Average Globetrotter. Later.